whether it's overeating, undereating, picky eating, emotional eating, stress eating, mindless eating, chronic dieting, compulsive calorie counting, however it shows up in your relationship with food, I understand it again from a mind body perspective that it's basically all the same. It's the human psyche just trying to feel safe.
Hello, beautiful listeners of High Vibin' It, old and new. We love you so much. Welcome back to the show. You are in for a real treat, a real delight today. We have a new friend, Miss Lisa. She's a trauma-informed health coach. She works primarily with disordered eating and helping people to align their mind and their soul and their body so that they can have a better relationship with food, health, their bodies, all of the above. And she actually had Lindsay and I both on her podcast, which we will get more into in a second. But she's just really an awesome soul and she gets it. So we needed to have her on the show today to continue this conversation, because if you've been listening with us for a while, we've done a few episodes and it's been building on body, relationship to food, health, disordered eating, things of that nature. So today we're going to go even deeper and continue the conversation. So Lisa, welcome to the show, and please say your last name correctly before I mess it up.
Thank you for having me. That's a great introduction and a great first question. Yes, you nailed it. It is Lisa Schlosberg. My friends call me Schloss, so you're welcome to do that as well. Yeah.
Cute. Love it.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
Lisa, I'm so excited to talk to you today and you have people get to know you, because I know when me and Kelsey were on your show, it was like the Lindsay show and the Kelsey show, but now it's the Lisa show featuring High Vibin' It. So I want to get into how you got started, what your journey is, what brought you to this work, and anything else you want to delight us with when it comes to your story.
Yeah, thank you for asking. So it all began for me I always say, like, from the beginning. When we have a relationship with food, we have been in a relationship with food since before we were even born. And I think that's always important to just kind of start with. For a long time, I used to think that my story actually started when I was 17, because that's when I embarked on this extreme weight loss journey. And I was a sophomore in college, ultimately, a few years later, when I ended up losing 150 pounds. And so I used to think that that was the story. But it turns out that there is a story evolving all the years before that. And so I'll share it with you the way that I came to understand it myself. That is, I was overweight my entire childhood, my whole life. And I have no memories of not being weighing more than I should. So my whole kind of socialization into the world as a human being was in a bigger body and being, as far as the doctors were concerned, morbidly obese. So I was over 300 pounds when I was 17 years old. And growing up, I didn't care at all. I was in complete denial about my weight issue, quote unquote, as well as any other emotional issues that I was uncomfortable about. I like to say the first line of defense for me was denial. It was just like, if I don't want this to be happening, it's not happening and I'm not going to deal with it. And so I identified as the strong one. I thought I had a lot of willpower and I thought I was really strong and I didn't need to feel feelings, and feelings were stupid and therapy was dumb. And I kind of lived my whole childhood that way. And I wasn't aware at the time that I was really using food and eating very much like a drug to cope with everything that was going on, in my family, stress, emotion, trauma, etc. And so I had always tried to lose weight. I was forced on a lot of different diets. I saw a lot of dietitians and nutritionists and doctors and specialists growing up. I went to Weight Watchers when I was 9 years old, and I always lasted about a week or so before I decided that it just wasn't worth it and I didn't want to keep up with it. And so that was what my childhood looked like. And then eventually I lost a lot of weight really quickly when I was in college. And after my weight loss, I got to this really kind of interesting place where I thought the story was over. I thought that I was going to follow all the rules and do what everyone told me to do, eat less, exercise more, and then I would live happily ever after. And it turns out that that definitely did not happen. And that was actually, in a lot of ways, the beginning of the story. That's where, for me, everything got really interesting. At the end of my weight loss, I I was really confused about why I felt really bad all the time. Like, I was really fatigued. I couldn't sleep. I lost my period. My hair was falling out. And I was just confused because I I was doing great. I was like following all the rules, but my body was not in a good place. And so I connected with a nutritionist because my intention was to figure out how to lose the last 10 pounds. And she was the one that said, "Are you still getting your period?" And I was like, "Oh my God, that's so crazy. How do you know that I'm not getting my period anymore?" And so she was the one who explained to me that I was in starvation mode and my body was malnourished and literally fighting me to keep weight on. And it became clear that I had turned basically a lifelong disorder of overeating into a disorder of undereating. And at no point was I connecting to myself and asking questions about why was I here to begin with and what was going on, that food and eating had become, a coping mechanism for me to begin with. And so that, again, kind of began the journey. And in a lot of ways, was the reason I started working. I had been in therapy for years, and we could talk a little bit more about that. But I kind of brought my relationship with food into therapy for the first time, because I was also very confused about how I kind of woke up one day and felt like I was living with a full blown eating disorder. And all I could think about was food, my weight, every calorie that I ate, every step that I took. And so after that, it was a few years of just kind of balancing out and learning how to cope with my emotions and manage stress and regulate energy without relying on food and eating and dieting and weight loss. And that's when I started to, again, just making a long story short, I started to learn a lot about the mind body system. I started studying the brain science of emotional eating. I started learning a lot about why all of this made a lot of sense, actually, and that I didn't have a problem with food or eating and my weight wasn't an issue. These are ways that I was keeping myself feeling safe and protected and comfortable to deal with the trauma of my early childhood. And so I started doing things like meditation and, grounding work and breath work and journaling and yoga and all these different kind of mind body healing techniques to just create a sense of safety and embodiment ultimately, so that, again, I didn't need to lean on food and eating and my body the way that I had. And so over the last few years, first I started as a personal trainer. That's where it all began. I was really interested. I loved working out and I wanted to help people. So I started working in a gym. And then I became an integrative nutrition holistic health coach, which kind of started to expand my understanding of the human being outside of just the body. And I started in all of that work seeing that, the way that people were struggling was not in the physical dimension. The way people were struggling was more mental and emotional and spiritual and social. And I wanted to get into what I consider like the meat of the human experience with people. And I started doing that as a health coach. And then eventually I went to school. I got my master's in social work at NYU because I was being trained basically to be a therapist because I wanted to really include, again, mental and emotional well-being into my work. And so now I kind of take this really integrative hybrid approach to working with the people I work with. That is, physical health is important, right? The way that we're feeding our body and moving our body is important, but there's a lot of other deep stuff going on in our relationship with food, especially. And I'm happy to talk about, the details of that. But so that's basically what I do now is I'm working with people who are struggling with any kind of disordered eating. And I always say disordered in quotes, like it's not a disorder and I will die on that hill. So it makes a lot of sense. We use food emotionally and it's valid and it's human and it's appropriate and we're not doing anything wrong. We just need to figure out, other ways of coping and other ways of feeling safe ultimately. And there are ways of doing that. So whether it's overeating, undereating, picky eating, emotional eating, stress eating, mindless eating, chronic dieting, compulsive calorie counting, however it shows up in your relationship with food, I understand it again from a mind body perspective that it's basically all the same. It's the human psyche just trying to feel safe. And that's that's how I got here in a very long story short. If you want the longer version, the first 2 episodes of my podcast are my story because there's a lot more to say. But that's who I am and what I do and why I do what I do.
Oh, I love
Yeah.
your story so much. I
Thanks
love
for
that
sharing.
you said, well, first of all, hats off to you. I bow to you, dear, because the fact that you're able to just understand it, right? It's one of the hardest, most complex things to really understand because, as you said, it starts from the womb, right? And it's so integrated already at when we're born that it's like it's you don't even know it's happening. So I love to hear when people are able to have that moment where that light bulb moment where they're like, oh my gosh, yeah, yes. Because when you hear it, when I was learning about helping people, and I don't say weight loss, really, I say weight control because losing something means you're going to find something. It's like that connotation of like, well, if I lose it, then I'm going to find it again. So I just don't say it. But with clients and when learning about weight control and weight release, perhaps also, one of the first things they say is like 90% of weight issues are emotional. And I was like, what? Like, of course, once you know it, it's like, of course it is. But until you come to that moment, it's like, what the heck is going on? And
Yeah.
so I love that you were able to do that. And now you're able to help others understand the deep connection between emotions, body, and mind, because it affects us in all sorts of ways. Yeah. So wonderful. I love your story. Thank you so much for sharing that. And look at you go.
Yeah, I
Thank you.
didn't realize that you were that big because you're a tiny lady.
Mm.
I mean, you're not like 6'7". Like my fiance is like ginormous. And when he told me he used to be like over 300 pounds, he used to play football. So I was like, okay, yeah, but he was still looked huge and he was literally so tall. But for someone with such a small frame, that's that's hard to believe.
Yeah.
That's a lot of extra. That's a lot
Yeah.
of safety, right? That's a lot of
That's
Yeah.
a lot of
emotional
safety.
safety that you're trying to create. And obviously of no fault to your own, just like how you beautifully explained, it's all emotional. I think one of the reasons why I bonded so deeply with you when I was on your show was because we're both so passionate about helping people feel their feelings and process their feelings in a really healthy, really sustainable, really nourishing, healing way. Because really, that when you can do that, it does heal a lot of different addictions, which are really just like symptoms of all these internal issues, right? It's not always just the addiction. It didn't just start with that. Usually,
Right.
it usually start with
Yeah.
something deeper, a feeling that you like wanted to escape or a need that didn't get met or whatever, and it becomes this coping mechanism. And so I think food or no food, it's important to just have the conversation again, like we always do on the podcast, of feeling is healing. And
Yes.
there is, a more beneficial way to feel your feelings and more detrimental ways to feel your feelings, which
Mhm.
we can talk about too. But what do you feel like helped you the most when you started opening up to yourself and like opening to what was actually happening inside of you? Like, what were some of the processes or perspectives that really helped you to do that? Because it can be scary at first and super intimidating, especially when you've been through something as traumatic as you have in your family. So, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah. Great
What say
question.
you to that,
Yeah.
my dear?
Good stuff. So yeah, so I mean, in some ways this will answer your question, but it also is just feels very present with me in terms of like things that I want to kind of add in terms of the context. Because I think in terms of there's a lot of like techniques and modalities and things we could talk about all of that stuff, but I think what I find personally and professionally really starts to shift things is education. Like the way that I think about it is, and I talk about this in terms of like my group program, I think many of us, or actually all of us, we're born into the mind, body, soul being. And we can think of that like a car, but most of us are like driving around this car, but we've never been given the manual. Like we have no idea like what is actually going on here energetically, neurobiologically, physiologically. We don't know. No one ever taught us. Like there's no class for this in school. And so we learn a little bit about nutrition, right? Maybe, but not really from like a mind body perspective. So the reason I say that is because then we grow up in this culture that says if you're struggling with food, there's something wrong with you. And if you have a, excess weight on your body, it means that you lack willpower and discipline and like all the stories of shame and failure and all the nonsense. It's total bullshit. Can I say that here?
Yes, you can
Yeah.
say
Okay.
bullshit.
Okay.
You
So
can
it's total
scream it.
bullshit. Right. And it's like, so not only are we like not given the manual, but we're given this like bullshit manual. And then we have no idea how to drive this car, which is why so many of us are struggling with food and eating. So I start there because I think the biggest thing that shifted things for me was learning that actually this is a bullshit manual and this is not actually what's going on. This is what's going on. So there's a couple things that like one, just when it comes to like brain science 101 and neurobiology. Okay. So our brain is always trying to like reach an equilibrium basically. So when the stress is too high, we will do things to bring our stress back down. This is why we have compulsive behaviors. We say yes to things we want to say no to. We do drugs we don't want to do. We eat food that we're not hungry for. Like we are compulsively trying to manage our stress and energy and emotion in a way that we must, because that's how the human body and brain are designed. So 4 of the chemicals and neurotransmitters that can bring our stress down, they're called happy chemicals. So there's dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, and endorphins. They all have a little bit of a different job in the brain. They feel a little bit different in the body. But 2 of the 4 happy chemicals are released in our brain every single time we eat food. So there's no question around why are we emotionally eating. There's no way that we would not be emotionally eating, So I always say like the same reason that like sex feels good is the same reason that food feels good, because it's biologically built into our wiring as a system to prioritize our survival and our evolution, right? So if this is where I always am like, if you consider yourself an emotional eater, you are a human being. You are built that way. There's no other way around it. So first there's that, right? Which is just like, oh, okay, like this is validating, but this is some information that none of us were ever taught. So to think that you're not going to have an emotional relationship with food is just unrealistic. That's not the way that we're built. So there's that part. But then the other thing, like when I think about what really started to shift things for me was, so you guys familiar with the adverse childhood experience study, the ACE
No.
study?
Enlighten us.
Okay. So this is some really good stuff. So in 1997, this study came out, and the adverse childhood experience study basically looked at adverse childhood experiences, which is like, the capital T traumas. So there was a 10-question survey that went out to these people in the study, and it asked about early childhood traumas. So abuse, neglect, a parent being imprisoned, a parent passing away, things like that. But it was only 10 questions. And what we found through the ACE study, which was, I think, 17,000 adults participated in this. And what we found is that there was a direct correlation between early childhood traumas and experiences and health issues later in life. So everything from stroke, heart attack, disease, addiction, 9 out of the 10 leading causes of death were kind of accounted for in the ACE study. So this started to absolutely like revolutionize healthcare and especially addiction treatment, because it kind of started to present that we're not really doing a service to anyone by asking the question, what's wrong with you? Why can't you stop drinking? Why can't you stop smoking? Why can't you just stop eating? But now we have this information that says we have to start asking the question, what happened to you? What happened really early on in your life that you had to use these substances and behaviors to cope with the stress and trauma and emotion you were experiencing? So it basically was like a huge kind of plug for mind body medicine, and to say we're all this human, system of energy. And of course we adopt these health risk behaviors because there's all this stuff going on kind of underneath the surface, right? So the ACE study started to change all these things. And when I don't even remember how I stumbled upon, I just started doing a lot of research. So at this point in my journey, there was this point where I had lost a lot of weight, but then I started eating uncontrollably. As soon as I started eating a little bit more to like get my period back and like restore my health, I was completely out of control. And then I'd go back on a diet, and then I would gain it all back. And then I would lose it again and gain it again and lose it again and gain it again, which is something we're really all familiar with. And so I was still in that place of like fighting my body. And the way that I grew up, right, very like empirical, left brain. I wanted the data. I was like, what is going on here? I just lost 150 pounds and now I can't stop eating. Like, what is going on? And it didn't make sense to me that the cultural narrative that I just woke up one day and lost all my willpower. Like, I was just like, there's something more here. Like,
Yeah.
no. And so I started doing research and I was very dedicated to figuring out what is happening? What's happening to me and why is it happening? And so that's how, I mean, I learned a lot. I learned a lot in just kind of going down that rabbit hole. But one of the things that transformed my understanding of myself was finding the ACE study. Because I remember at the time, the way that the CDC website used to be laid out is that there was like a little asterisk. It said, here's 9 of the 10 leading causes of death that are connected to all of this stuff. But there's this little asterisk on the bottom. It said, for more, click here. And I remember clicking there. And then there are all these studies about emotional eating, disordered eating, eating disorders, or obesity, using food like a drug to cope, and the way that food and drugs have a lot in common in the way they operate in the brain and the body. And that was the biggest light bulb for me,
Mm.
because that was the moment I started to ask myself, again, not what's wrong with me, but what happened to me. And then the answer was so clear because I knew what happened to me. And I knew that when I was 5 years old and my parents had their third daughter, so my baby sister was born, which is the thing that I wanted most in the whole world. And then she was born a few months early and passed away after 5 months. And my entire family was going through the loss of a child. And so when I was 5 years old and I had this massive, very confusing, very confronting, earth-shattering grief, I had nowhere to put that. I had no way of coping with that. I didn't know how to move through that at all. And so what I did was I wanted to make everyone else's life easier. And I just remember that was the beginning of me saying, life is too painful and I don't want to be here in pain and heartache and grief. And I'm going to do everything I can to not feel what is present with me. And that was the beginning of, I remember one time my mom pulled out a picture of me and she said, this is the year that you really started putting weight on. And I said, is it 1998? And then we like flip over the picture and it's 1998. And it's like, that's where it began for me, was I started using food and eating. And so I'm putting all these dots together and I'm learning how, as a kid, I didn't have access to drugs and alcohol and cigarettes, but I had access to food. And a lot of us do. And so again, this like emotional eating as a way of coping with trauma is completely normal, valid, human, appropriate. And it just started making so much sense to me. And so
Mm.
that's why, again, I'm coming from this mind body kind of trauma informed place, because you don't have to have big T traumas to have a lot of little T traumas and a lot of stress and a lot of emotion. And I think all of us as children are collecting all these emotional experiences that we don't have the space or the resources or the capacity to cope with. And then we have food and eating that can bring our stress down. And it's this like, this kind of breeding ground for an emotional kind of charged, quote unquote, disordered relationship with food that actually makes all the sense in the world. So that to me is so important in terms of understanding, like, it's so normal. And this is like the real manual, this is what's really going on. And so just shifting out of, the cultural narrative and the socialization around what it means to be in a bigger body and what it means if we're overeating and all that nonsense, but to come into a place of like, oh, okay, so this is what's
Mm.
going on here. And then that's what brought me into really stress reduction over size reduction is something I say a lot. It's like really
Yeah.
focusing on, how do I regulate in ways that are not food and eating? And that's where kind of the more specific modalities and techniques and stuff came in. But psychoeducation to me is is like the backbone of, all of it. I
Yeah.
think we have to start there.
Yeah. And I love that you said, instead of saying what's wrong with you, what happened? That's one of the most important questions that I have learned to ask clients when they're just talking about themselves and what's going on. And I don't know why I can't, and I said, when did you learn this? And 9 times out of 10, First thing that comes to their mind, they know, but it's the same thing that they've been trying to deny, or the same thing they've been trying to ignore or shove down or compartmentalize and just move on and get, and so it's such an important question. And sometimes just knowing how to ask yourself is the key, because of course we know, yeah, look inward, whatever, all the answers are within, whatever. But if you don't know which questions are the right questions or how to ask, then it's a non-starter. So for anyone listening, if this resonates, maybe just say, where did I learn this? What could have happened? If I did learn this somewhere, where would it have been? Because you always do. You always learn it somewhere. And you're absolutely right. Your mind, your body is always trying to protect you in the way that it knows how, with what the information that it's been given. Even in starvation mode, your body was trying to save you.
Yeah.
That's just incredible. And also not because it's, of course, that's what happened. But when
Right.
you really think about it, like, we are just so amazing. Your body's amazing. Your mind is amazing. Nothing is wrong. It's not a disorder. It's just, there are different ways, better ways, healthier ways, like, to live your best life and not feel a little bit off the tracks. It's like you're going, but you're just a little bit off the track. Let's get you back to where you're most authentic, because that's the second thing, or the next thing rather, that I wanted to talk about. Whereas I was just having this conversation with a client yesterday, where when there's a desire to look a different way, all I'm trying to get at as the facilitator is this something that society's pushing on you, or is this where you feel most authentic? Because that's it. If you feel the most authentic at 300 pounds, that's when I would say, be you, girl. Whatever that looks like, whatever that feels like, as long as you feel like you. But the problem happens when you stop feeling like you and you don't feel like yourself anymore, or you don't even know what that looks like because you've been a certain way for so long. And so just helping people, I think you'd agree that just helping people getting to their most authentic reflection of who they are, so that they can show up in the world as themselves, that's the name of the game. And whatever that looks like needs to be unique to the person.
Yes.
I love it. Yes, yes, yes. I saw
Yes.
a super interesting post on your Instagram, which everyone, you should go follow her on Instagram.
Go follow her.
In the show notes. But you were breaking down the different types of emotional eating. And I was wondering if you could break it down for us here. And specifically, selfishly, I want to ask about picky eating, which you mentioned earlier, which that was always my thing until very recently, when I had a health scare and I had to start eating better. And like probably for the first time in my life, I'm not like malnourished. I'm having the best periods ever. My abs are on fleek. Like it's all coming together because the right diet for me. But my whole life, everyone in my family on my dad's side, who they use humor to cope with everything. They're very politically incorrect. Wherever the line is, they step over that line on purpose to be funny. But now in this day and age, it's especially not funny. And they're all picky. My grandma was a super picky eater. My dad, my aunt, his siblings are all super picky eaters. And that's how I was too. And my mom tried. My mom's not a picky eater. She'd try to feed us everything and it just smelled bad. It tasted bad. It was just horrible. Like I would try it, but I didn't like it. And now after having a food revolution, I'm much more expansive in my diet. But I'm curious your insights you have on that. And also just if you can break down some of the other most common ones for
Kelsey,
us.
I already know why. It's because you were a queen in a past life and you have a very refined palate and you only eat gold and jewels. That's why.
I love that explanation. Thank you.
Also, using humor to cope. Hi. Sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry. You go.
Oh, I love it. We could totally go with that. I like that explanation too. Okay. So in terms of like the post that you're probably referring to is when I talk about the kind of biggest ones that I see in my own practice are emotional eating, stress eating, mindless eating, overeating, undereating. And the reason that I kind of group them together in that way is just to show that whether it's overeating or undereating, we're dealing with the same thing.
Yeah.
We're dealing with just a disconnection between mind and body that's showing itself in its relationship with food. So, but the thing that I like to say about it is, if we're struggling with something like emotional eating, stress eating, overeating, whatever it is, we have a tendency, because we're spiritual beings having a physical experience, we have a tendency to kind of objectify ourselves and see ourselves as a physical. And so when let's say you use the example of overeating. we find that when we're overeating, the thing that gets our attention is the eating habits. The thing that gets our attention is the fact that we're eating when we're, stuffed, or we're eating when we're not hungry, we're eating when we don't want to. And then because we see that as the problem, even though that is the total tip of the iceberg and not actually the thing that needs the attention, we kind of swing the pendulum to the other side and then try to like control food and eating, or like portion control and like manage ourselves and go on a diet and count points and calories and all that stuff. And then that gets too overwhelming. The brain cannot do that forever. There's a lot I could say there, but then we swing the pendulum back and then we're overeating again. And then we swing the pendulum back. And so many of us are familiar with that pendulum, and we could live there for an entire lifetime, because whether it's just like what I did, it's like whether it's overeating to hyper fixating on food, you could swing that pendulum back and forth your entire life and never actually come back into alignment and connection with yourself and your body. So the reason that I kind of, again, group all them together is because the point that I'm trying to make and feel like I'm here on this planet to make is that if you're emotional eating, you're not paying attention to your emotions. So something I say all the time is, if the biggest problem that you have with food is that you're an emotional eater, that's not a problem that you have with food. That's a question about how you're coping with your emotions. Okay.
Girl.
So, and the same is true. Like the other thing I say all the time is like, just because the hunger isn't physical doesn't mean it's not real. It just means that it can't be satiated with food. So we have to get curious about, what am I hungry for? What am I actually feeling? But so my point in saying this is that if you're emotionally eating, you're not paying attention to your emotions, but it's the eating that gets your attention. If you're stress eating, you're not paying attention to your stress, but it's the stress eating that's getting your attention. If you're overeating, you're not paying attention to the fact that you're full, right? You're not honoring the fact that you're full. If you're under eating, you're not honoring the fact that you're hungry. And if you're mindlessly eating, you're just not paying attention. So it's like the problem is not the eating habits. That's just what gets our attention. That's kind of the flag. But all of this is to say, for me, it's about kind of following the thread that is like, okay, so I notice that I'm overeating, but how do instead of turning away from that and trying to control it, manage it, and, judge it and fear it and quote unquote do something about it, that's just going to get the pendulum swinging again. But what we have to really do is learn how to move toward it and say, okay, so if I'm emotionally eating, what were the emotions behind that? If I'm stress eating, how can I manage my stress in a way that's not food and eating? It's really about using it as a way to follow the thread back to the mind, body, soul system to say, what's actually going on here and what are some other ways that I can cope with it. And when you're doing that and you build that lifestyle, ultimately, I mean, that's why it's like, I think diet culture has like used the word lifestyle change so much that everyone's like, oh my God, shut up with that. But this is the lifestyle change, is that when you find yourself overeating, you're not trying to manage your food. You're looking at that with compassion and curiosity and saying, okay, so I'm a human being. I was feeling emotional. If I wasn't coping with that, food and eating is going to do its job. But how do I, again, just kind of unpack that? And then again, same is true with overeating and undereating. What's going on that we don't feel safe to honor when the body says I'm full and the brain wants to keep eating, right? How do we look at that and really, again, cope with that? Same with undereating. So there's, again, like there's so much that I want to like say about all of it, but that's how I look at the kind of like different kinds of just ultimately being disconnected from ourselves. And then when it comes to picky eating is interesting because so when I first moved out to California, I was working with a pediatrician who is a specialist in childhood obesity. And we did really incredible work with families because we would work with kids who were overeating, undereating, and picky eating. And we would treat them all the same way because it's all the same thing. And so the interesting thing about picky eating is, and this is a good example because the same thing is true for overeating and undereating as well. There's always a like mental, emotional, physiological, energetic kind of genesis. Okay. So what I have found really interesting is like if I'm working with, and this has happened when I worked with I don't remember, she was like somewhere between like 9 and 11, and she'd eat like 5 foods. Okay. So that's really, I don't want to say it's really common, but that's a thing that we see. And what is really interesting about it, and I'll use just like some kind of like prototypes of the case studies, where some of the reasons, so we look at that, right? And we follow that and we get really curious about that. We're not judging it because we're coming from an understanding. Again, it's not what's wrong with the child, it's what's happening with the child. Why is this how they're coping? And we can look at, the kind of I don't even want to use the word like helicopter mom, or the like really controlling parents. And for a kid especially, one of the only things that we have any control over is what we put into our bodies. And so if you have a kid that's like really picky eating, again, it's very often not at all about the food, right? Even you're saying it's like now you kind of expanded your palate, right? It's not that there was like a food sensitivity there. It's that there was something psychologically going on that said, this is the only thing that I can control. And then it's really interesting because again, like I have training as a social worker. So I see it also through the lens of like family dynamics and family systems theory. And what very often happens is that, right? So what happens if you're a kid and you only eat 5 foods? You have all the control in the family. And then what happens? Your parents are like losing their minds because food and eating is so stressful and every mealtime is a fight. And you get to just sit there, not even consciously. Okay. By the way, for a lot of kids, this is not happening on a conscious level. They have no idea that they're, controlling and manipulating. They are trying to feel safe. And this is a way that their brain has learned helps them, period, the end. But
Mm.
then what happens, right, is that the kid is in charge. These are the only foods that I'll eat. I can say no. Why? Because I need a sense of agency. I need a sense of control. I need a sense of power. I need to be, putting my foot down. And we see that with, even 3-year-olds just being toddlers. But this is why, especially with something like picky eating, it can very often, and the same is true with, anorexic tendencies. This is the one thing that I can control. And again, especially when you're a kid, it's basically the only thing you can control.
Hey there, we hope you're enjoying this episode so far, but if you want to listen to the whole thing, we're going to invite you over to our podcast. Either search for High Vibing It on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you guys listen to podcasts, or even better, if you want to watch the extended video version of this episode that's even longer than the actual podcast itself, head over to our Patreon at patreon.com/highvibe. Lindsay, tell them what's awesome about the Patreon.
Patreon is where we have all of our extended episodes. As Kelsey said, we have it on video, so you can actually see the things that we're talking about. Sometimes we have visual aids, and it's nice to know what we're talking about. We also have hangouts that we do sometimes that are exclusive to Patreon people. And you can get started with all of this and bonus content and everything that we have only for the Patreon people for as little as $3. I think it's $3.33 a month. And that's it. And you guys can get all the benefits and all access to everything that we put in there. Really
Yeah.
cool.
It's really cool, really fun, super easy to join. And you guys don't even have to do that to finish this episode. If you're like, screw it, I don't want to pay any money, I just want to hear the rest of this episode, go to our podcast, High Vibing It, search for it wherever you listen. It's totally free. Either way, enjoy the rest of the show wherever you choose to enjoy it. And we will see you guys next week because we do a new one every week. Adios.
Bye.